One of Canada's strangest murder cases occurred over 50 years ago. Peter Demeter's crime spree began with the death of his wife Christine, who was found beaten to death in their garage. What followed next would be one of the longest and most bizarre trials in Canadian history that seemed more like a mobster movie brought to life. The case revolved around a $1 million life insurance policy that was allegedly Peter's motive for his murder-for-hire plot, and included a witness list of interesting characters, such as Austrian models, Hungarian assassins, and a former soldier of the French Foreign Legion. It would be determined by the court that Peter was guilty of Christine's murder, and that he hired persons unknown to carry out the attack. Although, many people still had questions surrounding the case after he was convicted, including those who were not entirely convinced that Peter was the one behind Christine's murder-for-hire plot. However, 10 years later, Peter's true psychotic nature would be revealed. He was not only responsible for Christine's murder, but would also be arrested and convicted for multiple kidnapping and murder-for-hire plots, and locked up indefinitely. This is the story of Peter Demeter. So for today's story, we're going back to the year 1973 in the town of Mississauga, Ontario. Back in the 70s, Mississauga was a much smaller city than it is today, with a population of about 230,000, and was more of a bedroom community for those working in Toronto. Living in Mississauga were Peter and Christine Demeter. Christine was a model, and originally from Austria. She was born in 1940, and her full birth name was Christine Liselott Maria Ferrari. During the late 1950s, Christine fell in love with the world of fashion, and she was frequently seen in magazines throughout Vienna. In 1967, Christine was involved with German filmmaker Franz Entel, and even had a small part in one of his films. And on the film set of the musical Das große Glück, Christine was introduced to Peter Demeter while he was visiting from Canada. Peter was born into a wealthy Hungarian family in 1933. However, the family would lose everything during World War II when Budapest was bombed by Allied forces. At the age of 12, the building where Peter lived with his family was completely destroyed. He survived the attack, although just barely. He was buried underneath the rubble for almost 2 days. Peter's father sadly didn't survive, and later his older brother was also killed in the war by a German bullet. After World War II ended, technically Hungary had been liberated from the Nazis. However, the country was now under Soviet rule. During this time, Peter was sent to the country to live with his cousins, and would later return to the city to become a filmmaker and a journalist. Because of his career choices, it didn't take long for the Soviets to brand Peter as a nonconformist, and arranged to send him to a forced labor camp. But Peter had other plans. He would attempt to escape to the West twice, but both times failed. However, 2 weeks before he was due to arrive at the Soviet labor camp, Peter and a friend managed to escape to Vienna, where they applied for asylum at the U.S. Embassy. For a short while, he lived in a refugee camp with others who had fled the Soviet Union. And because Peter already had family living in Canada, he would move there in 1956 at the age of 23. 4 months later, Peter would return to Austria to visit his mother, who was ill. And it was during this trip that he met a man who would be an important figure later in this story. His name was Csaba Segali. The two met when Peter was working as a reporter for Radio Free Europe, covering the Hungarian uprising, and quickly became close friends. Csaba would eventually become Peter's most trusted confidant, and would also play a large role in Peter's conviction for Christine's murder. In 1957, Peter would move to Toronto and began to invest money in real estate development. Although no one has been able to figure out where he got his money to invest in the first place. There was some speculation that Peter was linked to a scam where he arranged for investors to send money to Hungary with some promised return on their investment. Peter would eventually be investigated. After many investors complained, they received nothing except forged receipts. However, he would never be charged or convicted of fraud. But it was around this time that Peter created his construction company called Eden Garden Custom Builders. In 1965, Peter would meet another individual who would become a central character in our rather strange story. Her name was Marina Hunt. She was 20 years old and, like Christine, was also an Austrian model. He met her at a party in Vienna and was instantly infatuated with her. She didn't have anything in common with him as she was in university at the time, and Peter was much older than her. However, over the next year, the two would continue to write letters to each other, and Peter would continue to propose. He would tell her in one letter that he was now a business success and could offer her financial security. She still wasn't interested, but enjoyed the attention he gave her. And then in 1966, exactly 1 year after the two met, Peter wanted to take Marina out to celebrate the anniversary of their meeting. There was only one problem, though. She was dating someone else. Peter didn't like being told no, and would arrive unannounced to Marina's home and threaten her with a gun. Obviously, the two would stop speaking after this incident, at least for a few years. After this little episode, Peter would receive a letter from someone who claimed to be Marina's lawyer, warning him to stay away. And not long afterwards, Peter would meet Christine Ferrari on the set of the Austrian movie Das große Glück. The two would be married at Toronto City Hall on November 14, 1967, and they would have one child together, a daughter they named Andrea, who was born in 1970. As far as Marina was concerned, there would be 3 years of silence after Peter and Christine got married. That is, until October 29, 1970, when Peter sent Marina roses for her 25th birthday. And again for Christmas that year, he would send her flowers and a handbag. Marina would later learn that Peter bought his wife that same handbag for Christmas and told a reporter in an interview that if she knew this, she would have thrown that handbag in the garbage. During the summer of 1973, the Demeters had 6 house guests from out of town staying with them. There was Dr. Sybil Brewer, who Peter had met on an ocean liner in 1963, her 2 teenage nieces who were visiting her from Germany, a Canadian friend of one of the German teenagers, and Vivica, who was Peter's 16-year-old goddaughter from a distant relative. On the evening of July 18, 1973, as the group was finishing dinner at around 7:30 p.m., Peter suggested taking a quick shopping trip to Yorkdale Mall with Sybil and her nieces. It was spontaneous and random, but they all seemed eager to tag along. All except Vivica, who wasn't really interested in going, but Peter would end up convincing her to go. He also brought along the family dog. At the time, everyone thought this was strange, but yet the entire outing was strange, so no one really questioned Peter about it. Both Christine's Mercedes and Peter's Cadillac were parked in the garage, but the group would be forced to take Christine's car that evening because the garage door in front of Peter's Cadillac was apparently broken. Peter's reason for this spontaneous shopping trip, supposedly, was Christine's birthday was coming up and he wanted help picking out a present for her. Christine had decided not to join the group and stay home with their 3-year-old daughter, Andrea. When Peter and his group arrived at the mall, they agreed they would meet up later at 9:15 p.m. before splitting up on their own shopping missions. Peter and Vivica would go inside Burke's jewelry store and would purchase a silver locket for Christine. There were only 2 occasions that evening when Peter was briefly alone. The first was when he left to take the dog back to the car, because dogs weren't allowed inside the mall. And the second was when he called Christine at home from the back of the jewelry store. Vivica saw Peter using the phone and he waved at her, but she interpreted this gesture as he was waving her away. However, after a while, she would walk over to him while he was on the phone. This time, Peter didn't wave her away. He handed the phone to Vivica, and she would chat briefly with Christine. By now, the time was about 8:30 p.m. Peter and the group continued to shop before meeting up at 9:15 p.m. as they agreed to do, and driving back to Mississauga. On the way home, Peter would stop to pick up the late edition of a newspaper. As the car pulled into the driveway, Peter looked at his watch and noted the time, 9:45, saying, quote, "We're right on time, because that's the time I told Christine we'd be home." He would then open the garage door, but nobody was prepared for what was on the other side. Christine Demeter was found on the floor of the garage, lying face down in a pool of blood next to Peter Demeter's Cadillac. Her head was turned to the left, and her hands were folded underneath her body and not visible. She was wearing a backless nightgown, and one slipper was on. The other was on the ground, 5 feet away from her body. There were no tears or rips in the gown that Christine was wearing, but she had bruises on her thighs, shins, and right knee, and there was a large wound on her head. Her left eye was badly bruised, and she also had a gaping 3-inch cut above her left ear and a cut on her left thumb. It appeared that Christine had been beaten with a heavy object, possibly a tire iron or a hammer. There was also blood all over the passenger side door of Peter Demeter's Cadillac, which was parked in the garage, as well as the roof of the car and inside the Cadillac along the panel of the door, indicating that Christine must have been inside of it at one point, possibly trying to get away from her attacker. A set of car keys for the Cadillac was also found on the front seat. The car battery was completely drained, and the console between the 2 front seats was also open. The teenagers were told to stay inside the car, while Peter and Sybil went inside the home to check on 3-year-old Andrea, who fortunately had not been hurt and was watching TV when everyone arrived home. At 9:51 p.m., 911 would receive a call from Peter Demeter, who told them there had been a serious accident, and his wife was bleeding in their garage. But when paramedics and police arrived at the Demeter home, it was clear there was nothing they could do. Christine was dead. Constable Wayne Pollitt was the first cop to arrive on the scene, and his first impression of Peter was that something was off. Peter had little to no reaction to being told his wife was dead. Pollitt would also overhear Peter telling Sybil that Christine must have fallen reaching for something in the rafters, possibly the garden hose. But the rafters were only 8.5 feet from the garage floor. There was no way that kind of fall would produce the amount of blood that was left behind. By the time Detective Roy Crozier arrived on the scene, only 23 minutes after 911 was called, he knew he was dealing with a homicide. Christine's skull had been crushed, and her head wounds were consistent, with someone hitting her over the head with a heavy object 6 to 7 times. But despite an intensive search of the area by police, no murder weapon would be found at the crime scene. There were also no footprints in the blood left behind, and nothing from the property had been stolen. And as more police arrived to examine Christine's body and the scene, they became more suspicious. Her injuries were not consistent with an 8.5-foot fall. They were consistent with overkill. This would later be backed up by the pathologist report, who felt that some kind of struggle occurred that night in the garage. The autopsy would reveal that she died from a series of blows to the head, and such injuries were inconsistent with an accident, and were consistent only with blows being administered by a third party. And even though Peter had an airtight alibi, police thought he was acting a bit strange for someone who had just learned their spouse had been murdered. There really is no right or wrong way to behave when someone is grieving, especially given the circumstances, but Peter's emotions were all over the place. At first he acted calm and direct, almost like nothing had ever happened that night. and then he would be aggressive with first responding officers. And when detectives wanted to question Peter, he told them there was too much excitement at the house and he would talk later. Sergeant John McMurray would arrive at the Demeter residence around 10 p.m. and would say that Peter kept demanding to know why police were not doing something about removing his wife's body from the garage. And when police told him they needed to investigate the scene first, Peter responded with, quote, "Well, can't you get her out of here?" The officers were taken aback by his lack of empathy, and he appeared to be annoyed by police asking questions. Eventually, Peter would agree to be interviewed at the Mississauga police station and was questioned for 5 hours, although police wouldn't end up getting much information from him. He gave them strange answers and was evasive, like he was trying to hide something. One officer would say that the only time he felt Peter showed any emotion was when he said he was going to be sick and asked for a cup of coffee. Then Demeter became obnoxious and started shouting, quote, "What's going on here? Who's in charge? Why aren't they out there looking for him?" It's standard police practices that when someone is murdered, the first people investigated are those closest to the victim. But Peter's behavior also didn't do him any favors. He rose to the top of the suspect list pretty quickly. Detective Sergeant John Forbes of the Peel Regional Police and his team would search the Demeter property and found that all the locks to the doors were intact and undamaged. There were no signs of a break and enter, and nothing inside the house had been stolen. But police would notice several strange things inside the garage, where Christine's body had been discovered. Peter's Cadillac wouldn't start because the battery had been drained, and the automatic garage door in front of the vehicle wouldn't open more than 1.5 feet. And upon further inspection, they found that the garage door opener had been disconnected from the motor. At the back of the garage, there was also a 6-foot wide window that was nearly completely covered by shrubbery outside. Christine had no way to escape her attacker. She was a sitting duck. Within days of the murder, 18 detectives, aided by tracking dogs, would extensively search the area around the Demeter home. They even searched the ravine behind the house, but found nothing. Police would tell the media there was no evidence of a sexual assault, and there was the possibility Christine might have surprised someone in the garage trying to steal the car. But behind the scenes, it was discovered that both Peter and Christine had a $1 million life insurance policy on each other. Police also learned that their marriage was not a happy one. Peter would tell one officer during his interview at the police station that he and Christine had drifted apart. Perhaps he knew it was all going to come out anyways, but Peter also told police about Marina and how they had reconnected after years of not speaking. By now, Peter was the prime suspect in Christine's murder, even though he had a clear alibi. And when investigators learned about the life insurance policy, the affair with Marina, and that he didn't appear distraught over his wife's death, Sergeant William Taggart of the Peel Police ordered that Demeter's phone be wiretapped only 1 day after the murder. Back in the early 1970s, there was no need for a court order for the police to wiretap someone's phone line. Although the Bell Telephone Company wasn't too happy about law enforcement interfering with their subscription service. Sometimes Bell would even remove the bugs from phone lines if they found them. This too was also legal since there were no wiretap laws in Canada until 1974, when the law was changed and a warrant was required from a judge. In any event, 2 RCMP officers would dress up as telephone repairmen and spliced a direct wire from a box less than a mile away from Peter's house to a tape recorder locked in a suitcase inside the house of a neighbor across the road, who just happened to be a Mississauga police officer. Then, on July 19th, officers would receive a tip from a woman who said she was the former girlfriend of Chaba Sigali, the friend of Peter's that I mentioned at the beginning of this story. She would tell police that since Chaba was one of Peter's closest confidants, he might have some information about the case. When investigators reached out to Chaba, it didn't take long for him to open up and tell police everything he knew. Chaba and Peter met in 1956 through Chaba's father, while working with Radio Free Europe in Austria. In late 1968, Peter would confide in Chaba that he had come across some obstacles, and there was an unspecified person in Peter's life that he wanted killed. Peter would speak to Chaba on multiple occasions about this over the next few months, but he never mentioned who he wanted killed or why. In 1969, Peter would pay for Chaba to come to Canada and gave him a room to stay in the Demeter house, where he would live for the next 18 months. Then, in the late summer of 1970, Peter would confess to Chaba for the first time that the person he wanted killed was his wife. And for the next 2 to 3 years, Peter would discuss a number of ways to kill Christine with Chaba, and he wanted her death to look like an accident. Then in the spring of 1973, Chaba said he had become increasingly uncomfortable with these conversations and told Peter he didn't want to talk about it anymore. Peter's response was to become angry with Chaba and say to him, quote, "How could you leave me in this predicament?" However, Peter would never bring the subject of killing Christine up with Chaba again. Chaba would sign a statement swearing that everything he told police was true and agreed to help the investigation by wearing a wire. And at the funeral home for Christine's visitation, Peter and Chaba would go outside to talk because Peter was paranoid that the building was bugged. They also spoke to each other in Hungarian. However, the head of intelligence for the Peel Police Department was also Hungarian and had no issues translating their conversation. Chaba had been instructed by police to mislead Demeter into thinking that police were looking at Chaba as their prime suspect and that he was being intensely interrogated. Chaba also tells Peter that police wanted him to take a polygraph, and Peter would tell Chaba to refuse. And if he needed to hire a lawyer, Peter would pay for all his legal bills. Peter then goes on to talk about the killer in the third person. Some of these quotes will sound a little off because they're translated from Hungarian. He said he who left the scene left it, of course, covered in blood from head to toe because she was hit in the head 7 times. But then he goes on to say that he doesn't know who this middleman was. He also says to Chaba they should always stay with the truth with the exception of the valid point. But Peter never specifically says in these recordings what exactly the valid point is. He never admits responsibility, but he doesn't deny his involvement either. While these conversations were taking place, a white van was parked not too far away from the funeral home, and inside was a police surveillance team who was recording the conversation between Chaba and Peter. In another wiretapped conversation with Chaba over the phone, Peter joked with him, telling him that he knew Christine was having an affair and that she hired a private investigator to follow him. Chaba then casually asked Peter how he knew for sure that police haven't been following him in the days after the murder, and Peter responded with, quote, "Because I am free." Police were now zeroing in on Peter Demeter. The circumstantial evidence was piling up. Police had been digging into his finances and found that Peter had been moving money around to people in Europe with shady backgrounds. And even though no murder weapon had been found at the scene, investigators were confident that Peter Demeter was a strong enough suspect. There were also concerns that if they waited any longer to arrest him, he might try to run away to Europe. So on August 17th, 1 month after the murder of Christine Demeter, police charged 40-year-old Peter Demeter with non-capital murder. Police Chief Douglas Burrows would say in a press briefing that the arrest followed an investigation of thousands of possible leads, with police jurisdictions across Canada and Europe. Peter was ordered to be held without bail, and his preliminary hearing would be held in January of 1974 in Brampton, Ontario. and went on for a lengthy 4 weeks. Peter was scheduled to go on trial in the fall of that same year. However, his trial would not be taking place in Mississauga, but in London, Ontario, over 200 kilometers away. The defense felt it wasn't possible for Peter to get a fair trial in Mississauga because of the widespread publicity in the area. So they would apply for and were granted a change of venue. And they weren't necessarily wrong, but London is a much smaller city than Toronto, with a population of just over 200,000 people back in 1974. And given the size of the town, as well as who Peter Demeter was, and the motive for Christine's murder, the trial would take on a life of its own and become a circus. The trial of Peter Demeter officially began on September 23, 1974, and was pretty low-key in the beginning. The courtroom was only half full, and most of the onlookers were students. But as the weeks passed, the public would become intrigued with the story of the millionaire builder accused of murdering his model wife, as well as the cast of unsavory characters who would testify each day. Hotels in the London area were booked solid, and daily long lineups at the courthouse became the norm. Peter would be represented by lawyers Edward Greenspan and Joseph Pomerant. A jury of 9 men and 3 women were selected, and more than 100 witnesses were scheduled to testify. The prosecution was led by John Greenwood and Leo McQuiggan, and they would open their case by alleging that Peter had hired someone to murder Christine. Greenwood told the jury that he would present evidence that would establish Peter's motive for the murder, including the $1 million life insurance policy, as well as his conduct in his marriage leading up to the homicide. The prosecution also brought up his bizarre relationship with Marina Hunt, and told the jury that Peter was on the rebound at the time he met Christine, and that throughout his marriage he had stayed in contact with Marina. She even visited Canada in June of 1973, just 1 month before Christine was murdered, and would spend 5 days with Peter in Montreal, Quebec City, Ottawa, and Toronto. This trip would be corroborated by Peter's goddaughter, Vivica Esso, when she testified. She said that Peter told her that his marriage was on the rocks while they were on a trip to Acapulco just weeks before Christine's death. And he also told her about the woman that he met in Montreal. Peter would also confess to Vivica that he had been in love with Marina before he married Christine, and he wanted to marry her, but she wouldn't marry him. As Marina's name was brought up more and more throughout the trial by various witnesses, the volume of onlookers in the courtroom increased, and by the 25th day of the trial, the courtroom was consistently full. The day that Marina testified, the courtroom, of course, was packed, with over 100 spectators, and over 50 people lined up outside, hoping to grab a seat. While she was on the stand, she read excerpts from love letters she and Peter wrote to each other over a 7-year period. She also let it slip that she had been living in the Demeter house for the past 6.5 months. Marina testified that she was in love with Peter and wanted to marry him, and he never indicated to her that he was planning to kill his wife, and she still believed that he had nothing to do with Christine's murder. Under cross-examination, some of the errors that were made by police were revealed, including that the house was never sealed off while they were investigating. Peter and his house guests were actually allowed to stay in the house while police investigated the crime scene in the garage. Police apparently never considered the rest of the home as part of the murder scene. They didn't bother dusting the home for fingerprints, as well as the doorknobs or the 3 telephones, because according to Detective John Forbes, quote, "I didn't fingerprint the home because I did a visual check and didn't think it would be of any value. There was also a garden hose in the backyard turned on that was causing the swimming pool to almost overflow, and police didn't dust the tap for possible fingerprints either. 13 fingerprints would be located on the passenger window of the Cadillac in the garage, right beside Christine's body. And none of these prints belonged to Peter, his house guests, or any of the Demeter's friends, neighbors, or business acquaintances. but the RCMP didn't bother to check to see if the prints matched any of the prints they had on file, because in their words, the prints were incomplete. As the weeks passed, the press coverage for the trial intensified. As the prosecution revealed, it had new evidence tying Peter to the plot to have his wife murdered. And by 8 weeks into the trial, the media coverage was insane. So much so that the jury was ordered sequestered by the judge until the trial was over, and barred them from watching TV, listening to the radio, or reading newspaper stories about the case. There was also a real concern that the trial would drag into the holiday season, and the jury would find themselves spending Christmas locked up with each other in hotel rooms. The judge apparently made his decision to sequester the jury after the prosecution announced they would be calling Frederick Stark to testify, who was a former soldier in the French Foreign Legion. This is where things started to take a very weird turn, and all sorts of interesting characters would be called to testify. The murder trial of Peter Demeter almost evolved into a plot for a mobster movie. In exchange for his testimony, Stark would receive immunity under the Canada and Ontario Evidence Acts. He told the court that he knew the Demeters for about 5 years, and that in January of 1973, Peter Demeter had asked him to find someone to, quote, cause an accident. At first, Stark was stunned and refused to get involved. However, Stark would eventually agree to find someone to carry out Peter's scheme, but then soon forgot about it until Peter began phoning him 2 to 3 times a week. Peter would confess to Stark that he was not happy with his wife and that she cheated on him and called him all kinds of names. Stark eventually caved, and he told Peter he would put the word out at various construction sites that he was searching for a Hungarian small-time criminal known as the Duck. The Duck apparently earned this nickname because he walked with a waddle. The Duck's real name was Imre Olyniak, but that name is too long to keep repeating, and quite honestly, I'm most likely pronouncing it wrong. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to keep referring to this man as the Duck. Plus, it's more fun to say. A few days would pass before Stark received a telephone call from the man known as the Duck, and later would arrange to meet the Duck face-to-face in late 1972 and again in early 1973. Stark testified that after his meeting with the Duck at the Blue Orchid Tavern in Toronto, he then received a phone call from Peter Demeter, and the 3 men would arrange another meeting in Demeter's Cadillac in a plaza parking lot. Stark apparently tried to introduce the Duck to Peter, but Peter interrupted and said he didn't want to know his name. Peter would tell both men that the accident victim would be carrying a pile of construction blueprints rolled up, and the money for the job would be inside the roll. However, Stark would testify that things did not go according to plan. The Duck showed up at the correct location, and Christine handed him the roll of construction blueprints, completely unaware of the large sum of money hidden inside the roll, intended as payment for her murder. However, the Duck would then take off with the large sum of cash and didn't kill Christine. Apparently, the Duck also had a huge gambling problem, and Stark would tell the court that he wasn't surprised the Duck took the money and ran because he was the type of person who would cheat his mother out of her old age pension. Given that he had just been screwed out of an estimated $10,000, Peter Demeter was not amused. Stark apparently told Peter, quote, "You might as well forget about the whole thing," but also admitted while he was testifying that between spring and July, after Christine was murdered, Stark was trying to figure out where the Duck had gone. He was obviously hiding out. Nobody could find him, including his common-law wife, a woman named Maria Vishnitsky. Stark also admitted, under cross-examination, that he left a note at another Hungarian's friend's place for the Duck that read, quote, "Finish the job that you're contracted for, or give me my money back." Although Stark would once again contradict himself and say that he was referring to a drywalling job, saying that he paid the Duck $350 for a job that was never completed. Stark ended his testimony by telling the court that he gave up looking for the duck on July 18, 1973, because he had heard that the duck had gone back to Hungary. A couple of mafia gangsters would also testify and corroborate Stark's testimony about the duck's involvement in Christine's murder. The duck also ripped off a man named Robert Joseph Jones, the chauffeur who drove the duck the night he was to pick up the package of blueprints from Christine. The duck paid Robert only $40 for his services, instead of the agreed upon $100. And in Robert's words, he was mad as hell because if he knew there was $10,000 hidden in that package, he would have gotten half. Needless to say, the police and prosecutor wanted the duck back in Canada, and the Ontario Attorney General Department began extradition proceedings to have him sent back. However, this process would take roughly 3 to 4 months, too long to get him to testify in person. But police did go to the home that the duck formerly shared with Maria, his common-law wife, and Maria had incriminating evidence linking Peter Demeter to the duck and the murder-for-hire plot. Police were stunned when Maria told them that she knew about the blueprints Christine had delivered to the duck shortly before her death, and that she still had them hiding under her bed in her apartment. When police examined the blueprints, which were for a new housing development in Cabbagetown, they learned that Eden Gardens, Peter Demeter's company, was linked to the project. Back in Hungary, the duck was now under surveillance by Hungarian authorities, but they were waiting for court transcripts from Peter's trial before moving in and arresting him. Complicating things further was the duck had fled Hungary back in 1956 during the Hungarian Revolution and became a Canadian citizen. But under the treaty, Hungarian authorities were not obligated to surrender Hungarian nationals. If you're keeping track, so far we've heard testimony from a former French Legion soldier, mafia gangsters, and a man named the Duck is now a prime suspect in Christine's murder. But nobody was prepared for the prosecution's next witness. A man only identified as Mr. X would testify next. His identity was protected, and he arrived at the courthouse wearing a hood over his head with the eyes and mouth cut out. It was later revealed that Mr. X was a jailhouse informant named Galia Vareg. He testified that on the afternoon of July 19th, the day after Christine Demeter was killed, he saw the duck at the Silver Dollar Bar on Spadina Avenue and said he was very emotional and upset. In total, 4 witnesses would testify about the man known as the Duck, who was suspected of being hired to kill Christine. However, before the Duck could be extradited back to Canada, he turned up dead. And this is the moment I want to make a joke about a dead duck, but that would be inappropriate. The prosecution's star witness, Csaba Szigali, was next to testify. When Csaba took the stand, he would tell the court everything he knew about Peter's desire to murder Christine, saying that Peter had been planning to kill his wife for at least 5 years. Some of these murder-for-hire plots included pushing Christine down the stairs, hitting her over the head and running her over with the car, setting her car on fire with her trapped inside, electrocuting her in the backyard swimming pool, faking a break-in at the Demeter home, having someone else kill her, and then Csaba would kill the killer, fatally shooting Christine, and shooting Peter in a non-fatal area, and having his car sideswipe heavy construction equipment on the highway with his wife in the passenger seat. Csaba told the court that he turned down these plans as being impractical, but really he was reluctant to tell Peter not to bother him about this anymore, because he knew how Peter was, and he didn't want him as a lifelong enemy. Csaba testified that Peter showed very little affection for his wife and would ridicule her publicly. He said Christine on her own was a likable, easygoing person, but around Peter she was different, describing her as ill at ease and edgy. When the prosecution attempted to introduce the wiretap evidence, the defense immediately challenged it. It was their view that the tapes were illegal. Remember when I mentioned at the beginning of this story that at the time of the murder, police didn't need a warrant to tap people's phones? Well, somewhere between the crime and the trial, that law had been changed. The judge would end up allowing the wiretap evidence because, in his words, they couldn't go back in time and retroactively change what the law was. However, one of the more controversial wiretap conversations heard in court was between Peter and his lawyer. I'm stunned this case was never overturned on appeal because of this conundrum. Even back in the 70s, lawyer-client confidentiality was a thing. The court was told that police tapped Peter's phone line for 6 months, and 142 of the conversations recorded were between Peter and his lawyer, and about 80 of these recordings occurred after Peter was charged with Christine's murder. Most of these tapes ended up being destroyed without the defense or the prosecution ever hearing the contents, with the exception of about a dozen recordings. But the fact this was ever allowed in the first place is stunning. The prosecution was now finished presenting their case, and now it was time for the defense, who attempted to prove that Christine's killer was not Peter Demeter, but someone else. A killer named Henry Robert Williams would be called to testify. He murdered 2 women and attempted to kill another, but the victim survived because she pretended to be dead. He also sexually assaulted several more women in the Mississauga area around the time Christine had been killed, and one of these murders occurred within a few miles of the Demeter home. But these attacks were very different than the attack on Christine. The first woman, Constance Dickey, had been strangled with an electrical cord, and Netta Novak and Julie Sheldon had both been stabbed. All 3 women were also sexually assaulted and taken to secluded areas. And when Henry was called to testify at Peter's trial, he would admit being responsible for the murders he was arrested for, but testified that he had nothing to do with Christine's death. The defense would also call a former boxer named Joseph DiNardo to testify. His nickname was the Tractor, and he was also serving a 7-year prison term for arson, theft, and passing counterfeit money. Joseph testified that Christine had offered him $10,000 to beat Peter to death only 1 week before she died. He also claimed that another associate of his, named Laszlo Epper, may have committed Christine's murder, but Epper was unable to refute DiNardo's testimony because he had been killed in a gunfight with police on August 29, 1973, just 6 weeks after Christine was killed. And when police searched Epper's apartment after he died, they would find a slip of paper in a drawer which had Peter Demeter's name on one side. DiNardo claimed that his friend had shown up frantic and covered in blood on the night of Christine's murder. He said that Epper confessed to murdering Christine and was carrying shoes and a change of clothes. DiNardo testified that Epper took off his bloody clothes in the bathroom, put them in a green garbage bag, and then left for Montreal. When cross-examining DiNardo, the prosecution would attack his credibility and accused him of being paid for his testimony, something that he would deny. And then with that, the defense would close their case. Peter Demeter would not be testifying in his own defense. At that time, the police investigation was one of the most extensive in Ontario history, and the 11-week-long trial was the longest in Canadian criminal history. The case was finally handed over to the jury, and after only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury would return with a verdict, and found Peter Demeter guilty of hiring persons unknown to murder Christine. Before his sentence was handed down, Peter was given the opportunity to speak in court, and he would tell the jury that he accepted the verdict, but then proceeded to ramble on for a full 10 minutes, and then tell the court that he wouldn't be appealing the verdict, which of course was a lie. After being sentenced to life in prison, Peter's lawyer would immediately get to work on his appeal, listing 35 grounds for a new trial. But after another 2 weeks in court presenting Peter's appeal, it would be denied, and the Supreme Court of Canada would refuse to hear his case. Peter was sentenced to an automatic life sentence with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. The day after the verdict, Gladys Kelly, one of the jurors, would be interviewed by CBC Radio, which under Canadian law is a big no-no. Today, the law concerning jurors is very strict. The criminal code forbids jurors from disclosing any information related to the proceedings of the jury, even after the trial is complete. But back in 1975, jurors were forbidden from disclosing information absent from the courtroom, meaning that they could speak to reporters as long as it was in court. Several of the jurors would give brief statements to reporters in the courthouse after the verdict was read. But the day after Gladys Kelly sat down with Barbara Frum for the show As It Happens, 2 intelligence officers entered the CBC headquarters with a warrant and removed the tape, the transcript, and the notes, which in hindsight is completely ridiculous. I was still able to find a few quotes from that interview in print over 50 years later. That being said, the juror was most likely ignorant of the law and was never charged. However, the CBC knew better. Why they thought they could get away with the interview in the first place is anyone's guess. In February of 1975, Hungary decided that the man known as the Duck would not be extradited back to Canada to stand trial, because in their words, they prefer to deal with their own nationals. The Duck was arrested in Hungary and gave a statement saying that he did not wish to be represented by counsel and that he was not guilty of murder. He denied knowing Peter Demeter and said that he was an acquaintance of Stark, but never spoke to him about setting up any accidents. He did not take any assignments from him and did not collect any plans, with a large sum of money concealed inside. He said he only returned to Hungary because he was having trouble with his common-law wife and was homesick. But 6 days later, however, the Duck would change his mind and tell interrogation officers everything. He would be interrogated 2 more times in the months of February and March. And then on March 31st, the Duck was taken by ambulance to hospital due to lack of consciousness and died later that same day. Coincidence? I think not. The Duck's head and body showed no signs of external injuries, but a brain scan showed a massive continuous hemorrhage. Needless to say, the death of the Duck looked to be more than a little suspicious. While he was in prison, Peter Demeter decided to sue the 3 companies that held Christine's policies because they refused to pay. He was claiming he was innocent, and he had new evidence to prove this. These lawsuits dragged on until 1982, when the lawsuits and Peter's appeals were finally dismissed. In 1983, after serving almost 10 years in prison, Peter Demeter was granted day parole due to good behavior. He was moved to a halfway house in Peterborough, Ontario, until he could be granted full parole. While Peter Demeter was serving his time in prison, his cousin Stephen had custody of his daughter Andrea. Stephen was also the lawyer who represented Peter during the civil cases with the insurance companies. Then in August of 1983, 3 suspicious house fires were set within 8 days of each other at Peter Demeter's home, the same home where Christine was murdered. The first fire was not considered suspicious initially. Faulty wiring was suspected as the main culprit. One of these fires would cause $10,000 in damages, and another would cause roughly $60,000 in damage. It didn't take long for police to figure out that these were bungled attempts to burn the house down, but they refused to speculate who they thought was responsible or the motives for the arson attempts. All Peter Demeter had to do once he was released from prison was behave himself and move on with his life with Andrea. But for whatever reason, he just went back to old habits. On October 20th, 1983, just 3 months after Demeter had been granted day parole, police announced that Peter had been arrested again, this time for counseling 2 men to murder his 19-year-old second cousin Stuart, as well as 3 charges of arson for trying to burn his house down. Stuart was the son of Stephen Demeter, the cousin who was Peter's civil attorney and who also had custody of Andrea. Also under arrest were Michael Lane and Tony Preston, who would both turn on Peter in exchange for lighter sentences. Peter had paid Tony $8,000 to burn down the Demeter home in Mississauga, but even after 3 attempts, Tony would fail to finish the job. And while police were investigating the arson attempts, a much more diabolical scheme would be uncovered. Peter had concocted a plan to lure Stuart to a van parked in Oshawa and shoot him, and then pull his teeth out so the body was unable to be identified. After the body had been hidden, a ransom note would be read over the phone to Stuart's parents, alleging that he was still alive, and giving his family a list of 15 demands. Peter's fingerprints would later be found all over the so-called ransom letter. Within minutes of ending his meeting with Peter Demeter, Michael Lane would contact a member of the Peterborough Police Force and tell them everything. A sting operation was set up, and Michael Lane, who was now working with the police, met Demeter in a Holiday Inn hotel room to discuss the murder plot. The room was wired, and the entire conversation was caught on tape. Peter's motive for murder, according to Tony Preston, the man who set the fires, was revenge. Peter told Tony that his cousin had failed to pay property taxes on his Mississauga home. As well, he cleaned out the safety deposit box, stole some valuable Group of 7 paintings, and turned Peter's daughter against him. There was also Peter's failed lawsuit against the insurance companies, where Peter owed Stephen $60,000 in legal fees. Since Peter was in prison, he made Stephen power of attorney over his affairs. So Stephen charged a $60,000 legal bill to Peter's finances and paid himself with Peter's money, which he was legally entitled to do. Peter was not happy about this, so his solution was to get revenge, because that worked out so well for him the last time. In 1985, when Peter was brought to trial again, Tony Preston testified against Peter with the promise that his own arson charges would be stayed. In total, 25 witnesses would be called to testify, and the trial lasted about a month. Whether he was having a breakdown or just playing games, no one really knows for sure. But during this trial, Peter tried to take himself out with pills that he had been hoarding and liquid shampoo. He was unconscious and had stopped breathing when he was discovered, but was resuscitated. The damning tapes outlining the murder for hire plot were played at his trial, although Demeter would try to claim that the tapes were dubbed by police in order to incriminate him. This trial would drag on as well. Peter was even granted a mistrial at one point, because although he represented himself, one of the attorneys advising Peter was drunk on the job. However, in July of 1985, Peter Demeter would be convicted of 2 counts of counseling murder and received another 2 life sentences to be served concurrently. During sentencing, Justice Burke Smith also referred to Demeter as a very dangerous man, very intelligent, but diabolical. Quote, "I would strongly recommend that the penal and parole authorities should be very concerned about you ever being free in society again. One would think this would be the end of this whole crazy story. And under normal circumstances, it would be. But this story is anything but normal." A woman named Toby Bellman, who was a mother of 3, was Peter Demeter's lawyer during one of his many bail hearings and preliminary hearings. Peter owed her $45,000 in legal fees, but refused to pay her. So she retaliated by freezing 75,000 shares of his stocks. This whole mess could have easily been resolved just by paying her the money that was owed. I think you know where this is going. Instead, Peter's solution was to devise a plan to kidnap and murder Toby's children. While Peter was previously living in the halfway house, he met a woman named Lisa Ross, and manipulated her into helping him with his murderous plan. He originally planned to hire an ex-cellmate of his, a man named Michael Hodgkins, to kidnap Bellman's son. But this plan would fall apart when Lisa Ross failed to deliver a letter from Michael to Peter. According to Lisa, she couldn't go through with it because she was scared and the thought was too frightening to her. And eventually Michael would be deported to England. But then Peter decided to hire another former inmate named Peter Winstanley to kidnap Bellman's teenage daughter, Eliza. On July 28, 1985, Lisa Ross received a phone call from Winstanley, inviting her to lunch. After Ross received the okay from Demeter to attend the meeting, he instructed her to ask Winstanley if he wanted to take one of Toby Bellman's children on vacation. When she asked Winstanley the question, he asked for clarification for what exactly was meant by vacation. A price of $25,000 was negotiated, and then a later meeting for the kidnapping plot was discussed. Demeter's plan was to ask for a ransom of $300,000. He told Lisa he was going to use the money for the two of them to live in exile in Costa Rica when he got out on early parole. He also had $400,000 in stock hidden in an offshore account. And his plan, once he got out of prison, was to write books about all the things he's done and make it appear that he and Ross were living off the profits of these book sales. All of these conversations, by the way, were all recorded on tape by police. 2 days after this conversation was recorded, Winstanley was supposed to kidnap Bellman's daughter, and Demeter had already mailed the ransom note to Toby Bellman. The kidnapper was to take the girl to a hideout 260 kilometers north of Toronto, where the girl would be murdered if Bellman didn't pay up. Once the kidnapping took place and Eliza was in the safe house, Winstanley was supposed to get a message signed by Eliza that said, "Please solve the impasse in Metro West." This was supposed to be the cue to Peter Demeter that he was to start negotiating in jail with Bellman. Lisa said that Demeter was prepared to threaten Bellman with the kidnapping of all three of her children. However, Peter also knew it would never come down to this because Bellman would pay the initial ransom. Lisa Ross was originally charged as being a co-conspirator, but was described at Peter's trial as an unindicted co-conspirator and testified for the Crown. In July of 1988, Peter would be handed his 5th life sentence, with a strong recommendation from the judge that he never be released. Justice John O'Driscoll would say in court, quote, "Whether or not you are inherently evil, I do not know. But you ooze evil out of every pore and contaminate everyone around you. Your evil knows no bounds. It never rests. It never ends. In my opinion, this man should never, ever, ever be released on parole." And that was the last the public would hear from Peter Demeter for the next 20 years. Fast forward to the year 2006, and Peter Demeter would once again make national headlines. He didn't murder anyone or plot another murder for hire. He was just being difficult this time. He was refusing to provide a DNA sample for Canada's DNA database. He said in a statement to the media that he didn't want to provide a DNA sample because of 33 years of harassment from Peel Regional Police. Quote, "I'm not going anywhere. I am slated to die here. Or if I get sick, I'm slated to die in the dungeon of the maximum security Kingston Penitentiary, where they have a so-called palliative care ward." Demeter alleged that this was the latest ploy in a string of conspiracies plotted by Peel Police to discredit him. He even took the matter to court and begged the judge not to grant the police application to take his DNA. But in the end, Peter would lose his legal challenge. Canada's DNA laws allowed for retroactive collections from all criminals who were convicted of murder, serious sexual assaults, or declared a dangerous offender. So one of Canada's most notorious murderers would be ordered to provide a sample to the country's DNA database. Things would quiet down for another 10 years And then in 2015, Demeter would make headlines again. Corrections Services Canada had turned down a request from a Mississauga news outlet to interview Demeter. The reason they denied the request was they felt the interview could jeopardize the safety of the employees, but refused to give further details. However, Peter's daughter Andrea would agree to be interviewed by the CBC in 2017. In this interview, she revealed that she has cut off all contact with her father and only wants to hear from Corrections Canada when he's dead. She also stated it makes her sad that nobody ever asks her about her mother. People only ask her about the man who murdered her. Even after spending almost half a century in prison, Demeter still refuses to admit responsibility. His conduct in prison has been less than stellar, according to the latest Parole Board decision. He's had 40 incidents since 2013 alone, half of them disciplinary or behavioral issues. It seems that old age has done nothing to improve his behavior or to calm him down. He's also been diagnosed with a personality disorder with narcissistic and antisocial features. And he is in frail physical health. In 2019, Peter applied for day parole at the age of 85, but was denied. Most likely because the last time he was released on day parole, he tried to hire a hitman, but also because there are no halfway houses with assisted living willing to take him in. As of today, Peter Demeter is 92 years old and is currently incarcerated at the Medium Security Bath Institute in Ontario. For now, this evil man is still alive, although just barely. In his words, he's crippled, wears a brace on his leg, and takes 24 pills a day. In recent years, he's had a stroke, 2 heart attacks, and 3 bouts of cancer. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me today. If you enjoyed learning about this case, please be sure to like and subscribe. If there's a case you would like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comment section down below. If you would like to support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to donate. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.